Okay.
Oh, stream status.
Welcome to our weekly basic income discussion group. I'm Alex Howlett, and today's subject is education. And we're going to be talking about the expectations that our society has for the education system. Some of us have read an article called "The Broken Promise of Higher Education" from The Atlantic, written by Anne-Marie Slaugter in May of 2017. And she's got some interesting things to say about completion rate of colleges and how the people who are often saddled with student debt are the students who didn't end up completing school. So I want to start with a question, and the question is, what should we be expecting of education in our society, and how does basic income influence that?
You mean, so can you specify with respect to education?
Well, when we say education, what do we mean, and what should we mean? What does it mean to provide education to people, and what is the result that we want to get out of educating our people?
This includes like in elementary school age, or all the way up to higher education and beyond kind of thing? Okay.
It includes everything.
Okay.
So yeah, go ahead.
So maybe just a second. So education is conveying like information, perspective, like ways of thinking, skills. All these things are things that we can transmit informally, and also through formal institutions that have developed like techniques and expertise for specifically sort of transferring information, expertise, skills, etc. So that's like the foundation of what education is. I think that applies across different kinds of things.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm not sure if that spoke to your question. It just you applied it to so many
Well, what does our society expect from our educational system, and what is our educational system designed to do?
Oh, what does our society currently expect?
Yeah, and what should we expect?
Okay.
What would we prefer to expect in an ideal world? That kind of thing.
Well, maybe Richard had something, and then I'll come back.
Go ahead, Richard.
Yeah. Well, how the education system currently is, it's trying to make people into cogs in an economic machine, and not all people fit into the square hole or whatever it is. And so let's see, education should be to teach people how to think, not what to think. And how a basic income fits into it is that people would be able to pursue however or whatever it is that interests them. And I read an article earlier this week about how you can take out $200,000 worth of educational debt, but you can't get $20,000 to start a business out of high school. And you don't, when you're 18, you don't understand what $200,000 really entails, and how $2,000 a month for however much it is for those payments, and if you're late, you get however much a late fee is and whatnot. And when I was looking at how a number of my people, friends from high school and college, how they're complaining about how they have to incur debt in order to actually pay their student loans. And they can't afford to have Netflix or anything like that. And they actually posted an article about how people are skipping town and fleeing to other countries like India or whatnot, because student loan people can't pursue them there, and even they incur all these fees, but they're waiting for someone like Bernie Sanders or whatnot to rid them of their student loan debt, so they don't have to worry about that, and they're just going to acquire all the money that they would have spent on the student loans so they can actually pursue what they want to do.
Interesting.
Yeah, so I think the one thing that everybody kind of agrees on with education is that you are teaching people to do things, and that's kind of that's very broad and general, but I think it's also where the agreement ends. So I think a lot of our society, in terms of what we teach people to do, like Richard was saying, a lot of our society is expecting the education system to prepare students for the workforce. But then, more generally speaking, or kind of another way of thinking about education is that it's preparing you to kind of get the most experience out of life, or to enrich you so that you can live your fullest life and explore what you want to explore and maximize your potential as a human being. And that doesn't necessarily correspond to a job or a career or anything to do with financial return. We talk about education as being an investment, like you spend money now, or you go into debt now, and then you pay it back later because of the job that you get. Like there's this expectation that that's how it works. People think of it as like not just like an investment in general, in terms of like you put in the work now and then your life will be better later, but literally a financial investment. And you get this degree, which is a credential, which gets you the job or increases your chances of getting the job, even though you don't necessarily need it for the job in every case, that kind of thing. So there's a lot of things that I think are a little bit broken about our education system, because we tie it so closely to the expectation of a career and jobs and stuff like that. And something like a basic income, if it provides the financial stability, it will, it can free us to think more about different things that we want from the education system. Like, what do we want to learn about? What do we want to explore? Like, we're human beings, we have curiosity. Like, how do we get the most out of life, and how do we find things that are interesting? And I'd love to see education reoriented in that direction, if possible.
Your mom is there.
So my mom has some comments. She says, education should be able to advance human beings both individually and collectively with knowledge and critical thinking. What we expect in reality is that information is imparted insofar as needed for a job or career. I mean, I think that's right. And I think, when higher education was first invented, it wasn't seen as something that was necessary in order for people to survive. It was seen as, okay, you've got privileged, wealthy people who have the resources to survive, and they want to expand their minds. So
they go to Plato's Academy or something.
Yeah, they go to Plato's Academy, or they even around the founding of Harvard, most people were farmers, and most jobs, most people never thought about going to college.
It was to become a minister or something.
Well, there was a religious aspect of it as well.
It was founded, I would say, it was founded as a more specific job training thing than it is now. But it quickly morphed into not that, or I don't know how fast, but it morphed into something else. Because you used to go to become like a, religious profession, basically.
But wasn't it the case that the religious professions were largely academic? Like, you'd be studying scripture and that kind of stuff, and
I don't know. I would have assumed you had to go to seminary to have a group of religious, a religious community that you were in charge of. But I don't know for sure.
Okay, I think that's a fair point. But certainly Plato's Academy, or anything like that, ancient Greece and Rome, those types of things. Confucius, yeah. I mean, there have been times and places in history where people are learning for the sake of learning, and it's not because they're going to get rich for it or something like that.
I feel like there's often a mix of some other goal plus learning for the sake of learning. So it might be not like a job, but it might be participation in a certain political system, which is also part of our educational goals. So you're supposed to be voting for your candidate, or participating in ancient Greece, within the political system in some way directly. There's a lot of stuff that presumably you need to know for the society to go well. And even if you're not, even outside of politics, there's a lot of things that help the society go a lot better for everyone if everyone knows them, like how to read and how to do some math and, those kinds of things. So I feel but it can get way more sophisticated in terms of politics and stuff. So I don't know, I wonder if there's ever been I think there's always a continuum of sort of goals like that are more, and then just learning.
Actually, throughout most of history, landowners had any sort of means to participate in the political system, like lords and ladies, or well, just lords, and they actually paid people to vote and whatnot in ancient Athens because they needed people to participate in the political system. They and there were at least as many. Well, pretty much everyone had a slave, and only the people who had slaves were able to participate in politics because all their means were taken care of.
Right. Interesting.
Yeah, that makes sense. And it's interesting because we have so many resources and technology now that even if we don't have physical human slaves,
we have mechanical slaves.
We have the equivalent of mechanical slaves, and if we properly allocated the resources in the economy, everyone could kind of take advantage of that. And I mean, like, everyone does to some extent, but something like a basic income can give more people freedom to participate, and we've talked about that, and also freedom to explore educating themselves in a way other than what is consistent with kind of the standard college system.
Your mom pointed out, like, there used to be guilds and apprenticeships and stuff too, so like other ways of training for jobs.
Right. So I mean, I think that's a form of education too, and we shouldn't ignore that. So I mean, like, all these different kinds of education are preparing people for life. So the question is...
But that's broken down in the past, 20 years or so, with people needing to continue their education throughout their lives, at least they're expected to. Mm-hmm. And since the financial crisis, there's been it's been expected that for jobs that you need a bachelor's degree for a job that didn't even require a high school degree.
Yeah.
So there's a overqualification expectations.
Yeah, this is kind of the point I was making before, that a lot of times people are getting degrees in order to get jobs that don't even require the expertise that kind of the degree represents. But if you've got a bunch of applicants and half of them have bachelor degrees and half of them don't, and you've got plenty of them with bachelor degrees, it's not that hard to just throw out the ones that don't have them if you're an employer. There's no reason not to. So we do have this kind of like credential inflation kind of situation going on. But I want to get back to the point of education. No matter what form of education it is, it's designed, or at least it's supposed to be preparing the students for life. So I guess a question I can ask is, what kind of life do we want to be preparing students for? And it seems to me that the kind of life that our present education system is preparing students for, by and large, is not the optimal lifestyle that we can support in our economy and our society.
So I have a question. Can you point to specific things that you think are more or less in line with it? Because I'm trying to think concretely. So for me, for example, it's true that your college degree helps you get a certain kind of job, and it's also true that a liberal arts college degree like mine happens to prepare you partially, or at least within your field, for an academic job, but that's the minority of the jobs that people actually go into. I happen to do that. But a lot of other people with a major in psychology, most of what they learned in college is just kind of useful as a citizen, really interesting, helps you think better, helps you write better, but it's not really that and that might be the minority of colleges. I know most colleges skew a little bit more towards professional training, but they actually a lot of them, and this is specific to the United States, I think, relative to other countries, in the United States, we tend to have a lot of non-career focused education in college. So I guess I'm just trying to, I'm not saying we couldn't do more of that, but I'm trying to think what do you have in mind?
Yeah, so I mean, certainly for the higher end universities and stuff like that, there's a lot of just intellectual education that's not applicable to specific jobs or anything like that. And that's fine, but then you also have to ask the question, what's the reason that people are getting these degrees?
Well, yeah, I guess I'm trying to separate those two things. It seems like there's a separation between people having to go to get the job, or maybe that being some of people's reason, versus what you actually learn when you're there.
So here's a question. if the only reason people were getting an education at Harvard, say, was because they really wanted kind of the intellectual growth and stimulation that Harvard provides.
Or it could just be the brand, people wanting to have that brand of their...
Right, I'm asking not that. I'm asking if it's only for the intellectual stimulation and growth. If the only students were there for that reason, do you think that would improve the level of discourse and, you know, interaction in the classroom, that kind of thing?
No. I suspect that if I'm not sure.
Okay.
I'm not sure. So this is probably also like somewhat specific to Harvard, and I think in a lot of places, like the reason people are there is sort of, well, let me explain what I mean. Right. So if you didn't have like these other motives, like you would get a better job, like you would have more prestige, like you would meet more prestigious people, there would just be a lot fewer people trying to apply. So you would just be way less selective in who you were taking. And so like I kind of think
but the remaining people who applied would be applying for different reasons.
Interested,
right.
But the incentive structure is such, and the people they select are such, that they're really interested anyway. So my sense is that like the boost in interestness that you would get interestedness, is
that a Harvard word?
No, right. The boost in interestedness, I suspect that the boost in the interest level of the students would not compensate for the drop in the other aspects of the students as a teacher. Like in terms of my enjoyment as a teacher, like the degree to which I feel like they're following really high level ideas, they're enthusiastic, like they're amazing students that I can teach a lot to. I think that like I benefit from the fact that this system is like that, but I don't necessarily think that means that the system should be like that. I just think that the benefit wouldn't necessarily be that the classes at the most elite universities would be filled with better students. I think it would mean that on average classes would be filled with students who are more interested, and the classes would go better for the average university professor, I'm guessing. Because I suspect like most at least there are some university professors that deal with like students not being that motivated, students not really wanting to be there for the learning's sake, but I don't really see that much. And if I do, it's like highly masked by these students being like some of the best pleasers of teachers in the world. So like I'm not gonna tell, right? I'm not gonna be able to tell. But it becomes internalized for the same reason, and they really do care. Yeah.
So what do we think about the fact that there are all kinds of different educational resources that are now available that weren't available a couple of decades ago, like online resources, MOOCs and stuff like that? I mean, I feel like there's some really like top level content out there for people to learn from, and that people are learning from, but it doesn't come with the same credentials, and people aren't driven to explore it as much. What do you think about that?
You're saying people are not driven to explore it as much?
Well, they don't have the same incentive,
college?
Right?
Yeah. So I guess you can look at it in different ways. Like on the one hand, people do take a fair amount of advantage of at least the short versions of this, like TED Talks and stuff, which obviously aren't as time intensive as like taking a MOOC. But like they're really popular, so people kind of like just like learning for its own sake. I mean, for its own sake, like that's a whole other thing. Like obviously they might still be like getting to sound cool at a cocktail party, or like there's lots of things, but at least not like direct degree sort of credentialing is coming out of it. So that's one perspective, but like it doesn't serve the function of helping someone who's trying to hire them know a lot about them, because it's hard for them to verify that they did it. It doesn't, for two reasons. One, it's hard for them to verify that they did it and know this stuff, but I think more importantly is what you pointed out, which is like the college, I think, is largely serving the function of sorting people for the companies. Like almost if like you just got into Harvard and then immediately went on the job market, like a lot of the value would be there. I suspect. I don't have data to back this up, but like I suspect that's a lot of what value the college degree
because the Harvard admission process is doing a lot of the sorting.
The Harvard admissions process is very intensive. It does a lot of the sorting. It like finds a group of people that already have like, jumped through a lot of different hoops. And like, even though that's highly imperfect, like it's obviously like as a company, you might be missing out on the best possible employee. It's hard to sift through all the noise. And this is a pool that like on average is way stronger than a pool that like can get into any college, for example. So,
and there's also the Jared Kushners of the world.
There are, so that's why I'm saying kind of like on average. I mean, I don't know much about him specifically.
So, to what extent do we care about the education system helping employers in this way?
Well, this is like an interesting question with respect to basic income,
right?
Because like with a basic income, like I guess it depends on how many people are still working and how much that is still an important part of like how much an efficient labor market is still part of the benefits that all of us are getting in society. Hey.
Yeah, I get it.
So like I don't know that basic income means that all the concerns about matching people with jobs go away in terms of their importance. They might just diminish somewhat if not everybody's doing it. Does that make sense?
Well, first I want to point out that basic income makes the labor market more efficient.
Yeah, but I'm saying is like there's still like a decent number of people trying to like there's still a decent number of jobs left in the economy. Then I guess my question is like how much of this higher education thing changes, because maybe people still want that extra money and maybe those companies still want to figure out how to sift through people. And so maybe you still have kind of the same dynamic in higher education. I don't know.
So I guess a question you could ask that's related to that is, to what extent are people going to college because they feel they have to, or because they feel they want something extra out of their careers, or extra money rather than just the money they need to live a normal basic life? You know what I mean?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I think it's a continuum.
Right.
So I guess I imagine like fewer people might go to college, but the people who are still going to college, would the system basically look the same, is I guess what I'm saying. Yeah. Because maybe those incentives haven't changed, at least just with a basic income. There might be other things that would change it, but
yeah, I mean, I think that's right. But I do think a lot of the incentive to go to college for a lot of people is basically that if you don't go to college, you're going to be a failure in life. It's not to like get something extra. You know what I mean?
Or at least it's like one path that's like fairly sure, because there are actually other career paths where you make better money than I do without going to college. Yeah.
I just walked in.
Right.
I'm so sorry, guys.
No.
I'm late as always, but they have done studies that have shown that people who get into certain universities, whether or not they actually attend those universities, achieve similar levels of success in life.
Right.
So actually going to college helps. Right. But it doesn't, like, if you got into Harvard or Yale or Dartmouth or whatever, the fact that you actually attended that school ends up having marginal impacts on your life.
I have a question about that, because we were talking about this before you came in. Do you know if those people can advertise to others, like potential employers, that they got into the school?
No.
They can't?
No, it's a pure matter of character.
Is it? Okay, because we were wondering about also just like part of what companies want to know is like that you could get in the first place. Yeah,
I've never heard of that for being like something somebody bragged about when they applied for a job, quite frankly.
Right.
I couldn't imagine it.
Yeah, interesting.
But I got into Harvard. Well, how can you verify that 10 years later?
Right, if you didn't go there. Yeah.
Whereas people can actually see if you graduated from the institution.
Interesting. Do you think so? If that's the case, like I guess this raises the question of why people are going to college in such large degrees if it doesn't actually like make an impact. Do you think people are just kind of getting it wrong, or do you think that like we should be cautious about those results because maybe it's a kind of select sort of person who gets in and doesn't go? Do you see what I mean?
I get what you're saying. It's probably, well, some people don't go because of money. I mean, like, Harvard's expensive.
Yes, of course, right.
Some people don't go because like they get into Harvard and Yale and etc. And obviously those people can kind of be thrown out as like, well, you went to Yale, like the fact that you got into Harvard versus Yale. Like,
right. I'm assuming they didn't include those people, but yeah.
But the third category is the most interesting to me, which is people that actually never go to college. I believe that they looked at a case, like they had to pull up case studies for those.
Right.
But there are a lot of decent case studies of people who, like, there are a proportional number of case studies of people who got into a good school and did not go and achieving a certain level of success versus the people who actually went to that school. Like, the comparison is actually pretty good. The where you really get off the tracks is it's hard to track an entire acceptance class.
Right.
And it's also the case that if you got into Harvard and you decided, I think Bethany was trying to point this out.
Yeah.
If you got into Harvard and you decided not to actually attend college, then there's probably like a reason there. Like there's like some other thing that you're relying on to be successful or something like that.
You had other options.
For a lot of people, it's like, oh my God, I got into Harvard, now how can I pay for it?
Right.
And well, Harvard is generous with scholarships; they're not full. Like not everyone who gets into Harvard gets a full ride. Yale has actually been trying to do that for a number of years, and I think that their current target is 2025 or 2028 or some such. But the idea would be, a lot of people it's financial, and some people it's mental health issues, blah blah blah, etc. Actual physical health issues,
Right.
whatever it might be. But the fact that they got in is what matters more.
Right. And do you think this would apply for schools that aren't like the Ivy League or that aren't like the most elite colleges?
And so I believe I read a separate study about that, and effectively you only see it with like the top echelon, that exact effect.
Right.
Because you tend to get more. I'm going to say like if you put positions up from like ditch digger to like president, you get more people who go to Harvard or Yale who end up becoming president, and more people who don't get into any college being ditch diggers. So like the ratios get skewed, I'm sure.
Yeah. It's I guess I'm just it seems like there's a lot of information to suggest that like getting I agree that like the people probably we think it's ambiguous like how much you actually learn in college that you need for the job success, but that said, like it does seem like companies use it because it carries information, the fact that you went there. And it does seem like people are so motivated to go that I am a bit skeptical that like all those people are like could have been as successful if they didn't go. Does that make sense? Like I'm skeptical that everybody's making that mistake.
Yeah,
but I mean I could be wrong.
It's Peter Thiel who offers this grant or something like that to people who decide not to go to college.
Right. He did. I don't know if it's the continuing thing. I think it was if you can show him you were accepted to like certain schools, he will pay you an amount of money and you just go do whatever you want.
Right.
I've heard that went relatively well for those people.
Right.
As a general group, maybe not every individual. Again, it's like reading a New York Times article with some case studies of like, oh, this person didn't do it, and this person tried something and it didn't work, but who knows what they'll live to next, because this was in the last like 5 or 8 years, and obviously nobody's life that opted not to go to college 8 years ago is, what I mean, like
we don't have the whole story yet.
Yeah. Exactly. But effectively, like the idea is, if you go to college or don't go to college, you are who you are, and it's a matter of social connections and like checking a box.
But don't a lot of but those are important things, right, for people's success. So wouldn't that matter for people's success, like in terms of what jobs they get?
Again, it matters. It also depends what field you're going to. I have plenty of friends who are in like IT who never went to college and are doing great.
Well, it depends a lot on like how easy it is to demonstrate what the company wants. Quickly and like firsthand, right?
Yeah.
So that's always been my theory, and maybe I'm wrong because I'm not in IT, but like for why in particular in like certain fields, you find that it's less important than in other fields. So if you can like do a coding exercise or challenge or like interview, and you can show what you can do, like a lot of the value of the degree kind of goes out the window for the company, and I imagine they wouldn't need to use it. But I guess my theory is like if you could do that just as easily for all these other jobs, like wouldn't college start to stop being so popular, because wouldn't people discover over time that they could do that, and the companies would hire them?
How the college acceptance, or not acceptance rate, but the college people applying for college is down year over year, like the last 3 years.
No, we haven't.
Yeah, I've heard about that.
Yeah.
We haven't talked about it. No.
Yeah. So people are applying to colleges less because it does matter. Like people are seeing that it matters less for certain professions.
But that would have to be like recently and
well,
like
it's only over the last few years. Like effectively, like with IT, people are like, oh, I don't need to go to college to do this. And like companies are like, we don't care if you went to college.
Right.
I mean, like, I don't work in IT. I work in IT adjacent, but I have a lot of friends in IT, and some of them they never went to college. Some of them went to college for a totally different thing, like humanities degrees, and they later switched and just doing coding or something in IT generally. But like it's more all about skill set. It's not about checking that box.
So there's different kinds of jobs,
and
there's the kind of job where anyone can basically do it. Everybody applies. Some of them have degrees. It doesn't matter if you just throw out the ones that don't have degrees and hire among the ones who do. And then there's other jobs, like IT type jobs, where it really matters that you're getting the best person. So what they'll do is they'll put more effort into figuring out who the best candidates are and hiring those candidates. And then it doesn't matter as much whether you have a degree or not. What matters is if you have the skills.
Well, I would add the third category, well, a category that's kind of in between them, where like it does, like, it's not easy for everyone to do it, but it's also pretty hard to like find out if you have the right person. I guess you're saying they would go to the effort, but like,
well, what they usually do is they actually have the person do the job equivalent of the job for a trial period of time, and if they know how to do it.
But some things it's harder to do that than others, right?
They have I just read about it last month, that they have these like AI programs and things like that where they have a test that they have people, the applicants, fill out at their home, and then they.
So what you're talking about, so there's some aggregate programs that do this where like they'll give you a coding test effectively,
right?
And what they'll do is they'll basically see, is your code valid? They'll take a script and they'll say, does this do the thing it's supposed to do? And generally speaking, they're timed and etc. Also, like you have to put it on their web app and blah blah blah. And you know, they take that and they give it to places and they say, here's their script, here's how good it was for what it was supposed to do, and here's like the time it took them to do it. And that's a way to rate them as a programmer.
So it's like Top Coder almost.
Yeah, I mean, there's several systems that do it in companies, but yeah.
But here's an interesting question, like with automation and let's say coupled with the basic income, so that we were like automating pretty efficiently, do we think that the jobs that are left, I actually don't know, would they be the kind of jobs where it's like easy to verify the skill in tests like that, or would they be the kind of jobs where it's not so easy and you actually want to like rely on a lifetime of accumulated information?
Can you give me an example of a job where it's hard to verify?
Yeah, so like I'm thinking of my friend Andrew.
Doctor.
Yeah, I mean doctors, and I was sort of leaving them as a separate thing because they actually learn a lot of very specific knowledge like in their training. But you know, my friend Andrew went from like a PhD to this like research job where he started out as one of the only social science researchers on in a general company that's looking at how to improve like coaching, and they want like a research arm where they do research on coaching, and like they can kind of evaluate whether his research is good, but it's hard for them to fully evaluate whether his research is good. So like how would they even design the right test? And he has to like come up with good questions, but he has to learn a lot about the company and what they want before that. So it'd be very costly to like take some random, like, and how many people would you take? Like how would you even start all these people through this trial? Like I don't even know how you'd begin without some kind of sifting that happens before that.
Yeah.
So it just makes sense that he has a PhD from Harvard. He has his, bachelor's. People have verified him already for you.
I think it makes sense that if you want a researcher, you want someone whose previous body of work you can look at, that kind of thing. And it's similar for software. Like you want to look at people's GitHub profile and see what projects they've contributed to.
It doesn't even need to be impossible for the company to do it, for this dynamic to develop. It just needs to be. There just needs to be a market for somebody else who's vetting this person for you. And like, that's kind of what we're seeing. And the colleges or the, PhD programs are training and also doing that.
Yeah, it's a lot more about vetting than it is about training these days.
And depending on the field, like in a PhD program, like you do really learn a lot about like statistics and how to do research. And somebody who hasn't been through a PhD doesn't know all that stuff, kind of similar to being a doctor, I think, in my experience.
Well, I mean, learning statistics is...
What do you say?
It also depends on what your PhD is in.
Yeah, I was just speaking to this specific field. Yeah. But there's lots of fields where you learn something in your PhD that people don't know, not in the PhD, I think.
I mean, you get a PhD in English Lit, like, you're learning something people know, but you're not, like, it's a different level of qualification where it's like, I'm going to call soft arts, like sculpture. You can get a PhD in sculpture. Somebody will give it to you, I'm sure.
I don't think there is a PhD in sculpture, actually. I think Master's of Fine Arts is the terminal degree in the arts.
Is that?
Yeah.
All right. Well, I mean, in theory, like a master's degree in sculpture.
Unless you did like research on sculpture.
Yeah.
Which would be different.
But like, at the end of the day, there is a terminal degree there. It is past the bachelor's degree. Does it actually make you a better sculptor to have gotten that degree? Probably. Or are those all skills you could have learned or could have and could demonstrate through other methods?
I think this like goes to like the deeper point of experts and expertise. Like I actually do think, and this isn't just for jobs, it's also for like how to get information in our society, who to have as like advisors or who to have as people that we trust. I mean,
there is a PhD in sculpture.
There is. Interesting. Do you like research sculpture or do sculpture?
Now you're making me click on it.
Well, this isn't that important.
It's not that important.
But I think like in terms, as a society, we also need to have some information about who the experts are, because we can't possibly learn everything ourselves to like an incredibly high and specialized degree. So some way of knowing kind of, or having some information in the system, in the noise, about who might be likely to know something about climate science, or know something about epidemiology, or know something about geology, or whatever like the relevant field is really, really important, actually. And like, in a way, that's a macrocosm of like what the job situation is, right? You as the employer are trying to figure out like who actually knows these skills, like who can we trust as an expert in this thing. And as a society, we need that too. And so, like, in that sense, I think higher education is really essential.
So I guess you are talking about a third type of job. It's kind of like the type where it really matters that you're getting the good person.
It does,
right?
and yeah, exactly.
Yeah, so it's like that type. So there are jobs where it really matters whether you're getting the good person, and for some of those jobs, you can evaluate that person pretty efficiently and directly, and that kind of thing. And then for other ones, it's really about the body of work and the portfolio and the credentials and you know what they've shown they can do.
And part of exactly.
But then the other type of job is this one that I'm talking about, where it doesn't really matter who's doing the job, and you just throw away the ones that don't have a degree.
Right.
Yeah.
Or like,
and that's most jobs.
It matters enough not to throw out like a random half. You know, like you want, like, on average, there's always people who are going to like be a little more reliable. They might happen to be like slightly more likely to be in the college degree half. I think that's really what's happening.
It matters enough not to throw out a random half. Yeah, I mean, the way they describe it is just, actually, I read an article that was talking about, there were two hiring managers for different companies, and they were talking about how to get the right person. And the first person said, is giving advice to the second person, and says, well, you know what I do is I take the stack and I take the top half of it and then I throw it in the wastebasket. And he's like, well, what if there were good candidates in there? And the other person says, well, they weren't good candidates because they were unlucky.
Did I tell you that story?
No, it was an article that was around.
I'm sorry. I distinctly remember that article. I'm like, did that get released here previously?
Right.
I don't know if it got raised here previously, but I read the article back when it came out.
But I guess this is to my point, which is...
So there is this kind of... there is this idea that you can kind of randomly throw away half, but if you have something that makes it not random, it doesn't take much for you to just say, oh, well, these ones have degrees, right?
That's what I'm saying. And you only need like a little bit of an average difference for it to be worth it to you.
It doesn't even need, I mean, like...
I guess technically you don't need any, but like in reality, there clearly is like, and there clearly are like, that clearly is beneficial. Like, even if it's just for reasons you don't like higher SES people tend to have less, fewer problems as an employee. Like, it's not even their fault or like whatever, but it could, anything.
But then the other hiring manager was hiring for a job where they really needed the best people. So it was important that they didn't throw away resumes that had spelling errors. It was important that they didn't throw away resumes for people who didn't go to college or formatted their resume incorrectly or with weird fonts or something like that, that they had to actually like look at each one individually.
But here's another aspect that I'm trying to add in, which is like, what is the skill that you're like trying to select for in terms of needing the best people, and how correlated? We talked about how like measurable is it by you, but also how correlated is it with spelling errors, for example. Like in some cases, it might be really highly correlated with spelling errors. In other cases, it might be correlated 0 with spelling errors. So that's going to affect how companies treat things like spelling or errors and degrees too.
So what are you getting at?
Well, it just seemed like that was another variable in the mix that you weren't talking about. That's in terms of why people use college degrees. Because college degrees might be more correlated with some kinds of job skills than with other kinds of job skills. That's all I'm saying. Yeah. So I'm saying it's not just whether you need the right person.
I think we've spent a lot of time making one very simple point, which is that there are some jobs for which it really matters that you went to college and got a PhD and that kind of stuff. That's the only point you're making, right?
No, but maybe I don't know where you're going with all this, so maybe I'll just wait and see where you're going with it.
Okay, yeah, Richard.
And I brought up the game before, Path of Exile. Periodically they have they have interviews of their developers, and they do how and why they were selected and things like that. And they say that what they're looking for is for people with an established body of work. It doesn't have to be like a college degree or anything like that. But they have to be like they have this code that for the made a wire drawing or whatever move around, or they created their own game or things like that, and that they're actually motivated to do it. They're actually like playing this sort of sort of genre that they're going to be working on. If they're not interested in the sort of game, they don't know what was good for that game. Or
Wait, so this is how they like hire people and stuff?
Mhm.
They
Yeah,
play the
yeah,
game?
a lot of places do that. It's basically whether or not you have explicit experience in what they're doing.
Right.
Have you shown an aptitude and interest in what you're going to be working on?
Right.
And actually, that's a kind of a problem with tech companies where people are too interested in the thing they're working on, and like they work themselves to death or near death.
Interesting.
14-hour days are not healthy for you long term. But if you really love what you're doing, then you might be more apt to work those days, and companies want those people because they're committed. But at the end of the day,
Right.
that's not maintainable for most people in the long run.
Interesting. So I guess one thing that comes out of all of this is just that, like, I mean, we've said this already, but to the degree that you can find out what you want to find out about the person through other means besides the college degree, it matters less, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I want to steer the conversation a little bit back toward education. Filtering for jobs is one part of it, and we've kind of explored that. But like kind of the more general thing that I was getting at before is the idea that it's preparing you for life. And what do we want? What kind of lives do we want education to prepare people for? If it's not like life or death or a matter of living a decent life, whether you get a job or a certain career or something like that, then what should education be for?
Well, what are our other goals for education?
Or what should our primary goals for education be?
What are our primary goals? Yeah, I guess I'm still trying to think about. Well, I'm still trying to think about the work thing, but I guess you don't want to think about that anymore.
Well, we can think about the work thing, but let's get to some of the comments on here.
Yeah.
So my mom says probably any resume with spelling errors is automatically eliminated regardless of whether or not the job requires good spelling.
Right.
And my point is that no, that's not the case. I think for low-level jobs where it doesn't matter who's doing the job, yes, they'll throw away the resumes with spelling errors. But for really important jobs where you're trying to look...
See, this is the distinction that you keep driving me crazy
What?
with. And every time I try to argue that you're like, well, whatever. It's
What?
not that important. But I don't think it's just about whether they need the best person or not. It's about which qualities they need. So, for example, like...
I'm
The
saying...
best person for the qualities.
For
Yeah.
those qualities, yeah.
Right.
But,
And I'm
but
saying-
there might be another job that really needs the best person who is the most motivated and meticulous. And that
If the job is being a professional speller, then yeah, you're going to throw
Right,
away
but
the
there are
resume
things
with
that are
spelling
really
errors.
close to that, like
Yeah.
where you need someone who's proofreading, for example. If you're hiring a proofreader, you're going to care about the
Yes.
spelling. If you're hiring,
Exactly. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm making a separate point.
Okay, well,
I'm just making a separate point that there are many jobs for which you need a specific thing, and you don't want to get distracted by other things that are unrelated to that thing, right? So maybe
Yeah,
spelling
okay.
is one of those things, or
Right.
properly formatting a resume
that's
is one of those
yeah,
things.
that's fine.
So, for example, if you're trying to hire an engineer at Google or something like that, you're not going to worry about, like spelling errors might be like, oh, what's up with the spelling errors? But that's not immediately a reason to throw away the resume, right?
I have seen a resume of someone from another country that like the person
Right.
spell much in English, but it doesn't freaking matter.
Yeah, of course.
they're a
If there, I was
programmer.
actually just
Right.
going to say, like,
Yeah,
also
like,
if it's from
we
another
have a
country,
great-
it's a
I
different
work with
signal.
a really great Chinese programmer,
Right.
and it's like I don't care that he spelled there wrong.
No,
Like,
no, no. Yeah, I
Right.
mean, it depends on what you need, right? And also,
Right.
if they're from another country, it's a different level of like information than if they're not from another country too. But,
So,
but yeah.
so my mom points out that bad spelling is always distracting, and that's fine. But sometimes you actually lose a lot. You pay a huge cost to not hiring that person who would have been a really good employee because of the spelling mistakes.
Actually, Theodore Roosevelt and a number of other people, like Samuel Clemens, wanted to simplify English entirely and get rid of photosynthesis with PH. They just wanted to have an F in photos.
Yeah, elephant was supposed to be with an F also. I mean, this is kind of getting into like.
They wanted to get rid of the
territory.
Greek origins
So-
and the
It's
what.
getting
So
into,
this
like,
is not-
territory.
This
That's
is
all
not right. So my mom says that bad spelling is always distracting. She doesn't agree with what I just said. So, I mean, just imagine a scenario in which there's only one person in the world who can do this job this well, and that person happens to have a spelling mistake on their resume. That's a huge loss for the company. if you throw away that resume. So I mean, like, bad spelling might always be distracting, and I think, you know, the article that David and I were talking about before, we were talking about how, or it mentions how, you know, they're filtering based on these things, and then you're losing people who would be really good employees in that way. So yeah. So another comment my mom made was the application process itself has been cited as being unable to see creativity, only tangibles, grades, etc. This charge is leveled at Harvard especially.
It is. That's interesting.
Yeah, what do you think?
Well, I wouldn't level it at Harvard specifically.
Yeah, actually, Harvard has some other issues that are quite the opposite of that going on right now.
I guess I would say, like, it takes decent levels of creativity in a fair number of courses to get good grades at Harvard. I assume that's true in a lot of other places. But I agree that, like, creativity is a hard thing to be reflected in these kinds of things. And I guess it depends on what you mean by creativity, right? So, like, if you mean some thinking of things that are just, like, so off the wall, like your teacher is unlikely to even understand them, even if they're an expert in their own field, then like by definition the grades are going to be hard to reflect that. But I think average levels of creativity within the domain of like that area of thinking get captured like medium well, but maybe not amazing. I mean, depending on the school and the grading criteria. And actually at a place like Harvard, so I've taught at two places actually. I taught briefly at Stony Brook. A place like Harvard that has so much more money, has so much more teaching, has a lot more like writing assignments and more creative assignments. So when I was teaching at Stony Brook, they barely did any writing or creative assignments at all. So I would suspect that at places with more money, the grades reflect creativity a little better. But I don't know the arguments exactly about why Harvard less than other places. Yeah. People like to take shots at the...
So what I was going to say about Harvard application process real quick is they don't see creativity. They've actually, like the whole lawsuit against Harvard.
Oh, this is the application to Harvard process?
Yes.
Oh,
that's what we're talking about.
I thought you were talking about people who get a degree from Harvard.
Oh yeah,
no.
I think it's the application to Harvard process, and like well, I'm not going to get into the details of that whole lawsuit, but I'm sure you've probably read some things about it that would kind of reflect that maybe that's not quite right.
That this isn't right. That they do take creativity into account.
With a tinge of racial bias.
Interesting. I guess I haven't been part of the admissions process at all, but my sense is that the students have done really incredible creative things even before college, and like a lot of that is part of how they got in. Yeah. So I don't know.
They're very much like there's a very good article being like not necessarily the right word here.
Radio programming.
Yeah, This American Life did a big expose about the whole Harvard admissions process. I suggest,
Interesting.
But it explicitly kind of shows how creativity doesn't matter. Or it does matter at Harvard, and how that can be racially biased.
Interesting. What do they mean? Like, what would be an example?
Basically, there's a lot of students who were not admitted to Harvard who were Asian, based on the idea that they were not actually doing things good that were for good. They were trying to build resumes. And this was like a thing that came out in like admission paperwork and blah blah blah. So
there's like that too cool, not cool enough for Harvard, and so their MIT material or something like that.
Yeah, like somebody actually wrote that. You know, somebody's like, you know, they interviewed with a graduate student, or not with a graduate student, with a former graduate, and like somebody said like, you know, this isn't your normal like the application actually said this isn't somebody that has no personality and belongs to MIT instead of Harvard, but there were like racial comments, and they weren't like negative. They were like, this person defies any racial stereotypes. Please don't overlook them because you are capping the number of Asian American students who you're admitting.
Interesting. Yeah, I don't know about those. I guess I don't know about any of this really, but in my experience, like I think my creative stuff in high school helped me get into college. That's just one person, but in my experience, like people who have written their own opera by the time they're applying to Harvard, or written books, or like novels, or obviously like it's tricky because you have to be able to show it or verify it in some way, and there's lots of creativity that like the college can't really know about, or the admissions people can't really know about, but those people who have demonstrated it in some way, my sense is that like, and again, even more in America probably than in most other places, like we actually take that into account in the admissions process, as opposed to like you just get a certain score, like the guy from Ireland I was talking to, you get a certain score and that determines whether you get in like on the test. And that's true in a lot of countries, and here we kind of have this process that can be open to like a lot more bias, but also like I think does attempt to take things like creativity into account, at least as turned into like achievements. So me personally, like I ran musical theater with kids, by sort of my own initiative when I was in high school, and like wrote about it in my essay, and I didn't do that at the time, like thinking of college, so I think I had sort of the right attitude about it, and that I'm sure was one of the factors that like helped me get in early, in addition to all the other things that I did. So so I don't know. I mean, I guess it's hard. Like a good question we could ask is like,
how do you take creativity?
How do you take it into more than they already do, at least?
Right. Yeah.
Well, they weighted. Like there's actually like a weighting given to like how creative is this person.
Oh, so you could give a higher weight, I guess.
I mean, you could, but like
the question is, how do you figure out the weight?
I guess that was more my question.
How do you
like,
know
how do you figure it
creative
out
someone
well?
is?
Yeah. How do you assign that proportionally? Like a highly creative person who got bad grades won't get in. Well, that's not necessarily true. If you're really, really creative and you got not perfect grades, you might get in. Like, what do you define bad as? Like, some people will say like an A- is bad, and some people will say a D+ is bad.
Right.
You know, some people, like it's everything is subjective at the end of the day. Like literally everything in the process, unless you take something that is objective, like a test score.
Right.
In which case, it is subjective based on that person's life experience, which is why they don't really do scores anymore, because they've shown bias.
I guess one of the things like that this brings me back to is kind of your higher order question, Alex, about like what even should this institution be doing, and maybe one of the reasons, like maybe Harvard is selecting for exactly the people that Harvard wants, or roughly speaking, but the problem is more that like to have a decent life, like people feel like they need, or like it seems like you need to get into one of these colleges, and maybe that's like the bigger problem, you know, because you're right, they're selecting for some combination of the kind of person who gets really great grades but also has some creativity. They could be like a dance school or music school or something else that's selecting more for creativity. We have those too. So I don't know, I guess maybe I think the question is like the problem is maybe like the fact that it seems like everyone needs to get into them in the first place, kind of thing.
Art got lost accreditation.
Wait, who did?
Art.
What, ARC?
Art, the Harvard theater school.
Oh, I wasn't talking about a Harvard specific dance school.
Oh,
I didn't know about that.
Sorry.
I just meant like you could, if you're going to like
Juilliard,
Rhode Island School of Design, maybe, or Juilliard or something, their criteria are going to be really different.
Oh yeah.
So like, you know, I think what happens is like, on the surface, it's like, oh, there's these different schools, they're training for different things.
Sorry, we're talking about like Harvard specifically.
I wasn't.
Also
I expanded. Sorry. But I guess all I'm saying is like, I think part of the problem is that people are so concerned about how their lives are going to go if they don't get into these schools, and getting into these schools can be one of the only, I don't even know if this is true, but it can be perceived as like a way towards social mobility, and I think it really is for some people. That I see the examples of that at least, but like there aren't maybe enough other ways of social mobility. So then there's like kind of all this pressure for this one institution, but in the end, as Alex, I think you would often point out too, like in the end, the same number of people are getting into Harvard. So, you know, okay, so like you're getting like maybe a slightly more qualified person in, but is that really the problem, or is it all the people that aren't having a decent enough life in the first place? And that number is not changing by like changing the criteria for getting in. And sometimes I wonder if people are kind of jumbling those things together.
Yeah, there's this idea of making it more fair, but then there's also this idea of like more people need it.
Yeah, I guess that kind of thing. Or I guess it comes to your question of like, what is the purpose of like, why do we care who gets into Harvard? Like, do we care because like those people get certain jobs and we don't think the best people are getting into those jobs? Because that's not the argument I usually hear, but that might be one. Or is it this more like this fairness thing, like only certain people are having decent lives, we want to somehow make sure it's meritocratic in some way, and we're debating what it should be based on. And
Richard.
What do you think about all these like satellite universities of Georgetown and things in like China and other places?
Oh, interesting. I actually don't know much about that.
Yeah, Duke has a university in like the Middle East, and it's a big thing. I have my own opinion about these. I'm sorry.
Interesting. I honestly I don't know anything about it actually, but I haven't heard about it. That's interesting.
It tends to be what I'm going to call like Harvard and Yale aren't going to do it, or they haven't done it to date. Like I don't think any actual Ivy League school has, but you get the like I'm going to call them like second tier. Not to say that they're worse than the Ivy League, but to say that like people regard them less highly.
Right.
And like I think Duke has done it. I think like Georgetown has done it. University of Maryland randomly teaches on every military campus in the world, the U.S. military, or of any size anyway. They just made a deal with the military.
Okay.
it's just kind of interesting.
Yeah. Are they mostly teaching like expats, or are they teaching like if you have like the Duke?
No,
Well, they're
teaching,
teaching like actually like Chinese people mostly.
Yeah, in China, they'll teach Chinese people in China, and they charge them the U.S. tuition rate, so that person can say they got their degree from an American institution.
Interesting.
But they maybe can't get a visa, or they can't, like, it's a little bit cheaper. So like, maybe there's some cost considerations there, and then the cost of living in most of these countries is lower in addition. You tend to see it with technical degrees more than anything.
Interesting.
Like Georgetown Law is not opening in China.
Right.
Georgetown is, I remember there is a school that opened, like an engineering school in the Middle East.
Interesting.
Because they literally couldn't get all their students that wanted to come here visas. And that was the actual practical
So
reason.
there's like a lot of demand in that area, and so they figure, okay, let's just go to that area, basically.
Yeah, basically let's open up another branch there
Right.
to specialize in engineering and offer some other secondary programs.
That's interesting.
Um,
Sort of makes sense, I guess, on the surface. I don't know much about
Yeah,
it. I don't know anything about it besides what you just told me, but
yeah.
That's
I don't remember what school it was, but I know there's an engineering program specifically.
Right.
I
Also,
think it was Berkeley.
was it Berkeley?
Mm-hmm.
The other thing is, like, Duke opened a campus in San Francisco randomly
That's funny.
to try to like capture some people there.
Right.
Which, are they applying the same standards to people get in there? Does the degree mean as much? Blah blah blah.
Yeah, that's
But
interesting.
this is all like
I
bigger
hadn't heard of
picture
this,
than
like other campus thing.
the exact topic at hand.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, if they're sending their second-rate professors to these secondary and tertiary campuses, then that's a different matter, where they're kind of tarnishing the name of their own programs.
Right.
Or if they're letting in people that they wouldn't otherwise have qualified for their program to fill up these programs.
Yeah. Right. That's interesting. One point your mom's still making also about like the college application process, I guess, just makes me think that, as with the companies, like it takes a lot of resources for colleges to take something like creativity into account at all.
Yeah.
It's easy to just have like a test score and grade algorithm, which I think some schools have. Like she's probably pointing out, and so I guess that is probably the more elite schools take it into account more than others, and that's probably a problem too.
I think that's right.
Yeah.
And she does make a point here. There are plenty of other candidates, though. It's like going to an interview in a bathing suit. It shows no understanding of the process. And I think...
Oh, it's the spelling thing,
Look at the comment above that, though, and just realize that, like, there's a little bit of irony there.
Yeah.
Oh, like, depends on what job you're trying to have, yeah.
Yeah.
It depends on what job you're trying to have.
In a bathing suit is perfectly appropriate.
For Hooters, yeah.
Yeah.
You completely understand the process.
But,
totally, yeah.
I think this is an interesting point, because when you talk about admissions to Harvard, there's a specific number of slots. And then for some employers, they have a specific number of job openings, and they're hiring that specific number of people to fill those openings. But then there's another type of job where it's not about we have a specific number of openings. It's about, if there are good people out there, we always want to add them. As soon as we find another good person, we want to hire that person because we'll find something for them to do in our business. Mm-hmm. So Google is like that, right? When they hire. So it is not the case that there are plenty of other candidates. There aren't any other candidates. Any candidate they find that is worth hiring, they will hire, right? It's not like that candidate had a spelling error so they can just hire someone else instead, because there aren't a fixed number of job openings.
Right.
So I think that's another important distinction.
That is. I think I don't want to belabor this like filtering point to death, but I think the other point your mom's making is similar to the one I was trying to make, which is there are a lot of things that people are looking for that are highly correlated with other things that seem trivial on the surface, but are actually like used because they're correlated with something else that's hard to measure directly. And so knowledge of the process is
I'm making a separate point.
Okay, well, I'm making now a separate point from the one that you're making. Knowledge of the process is one of them, which people might care about because it correlates with a whole bunch of other things that they care about that are hard to measure directly, and so on.
Yeah.
Right?
Yep.
Yeah.
I was just going to make a separate point.
Yeah, go ahead.
Separate point. Yeah.
Go ahead, Dan.
No, I literally had nothing to say. I just thought it was funny.
Oh, I see.
Like, he said making a separate point. You're like, well, I'm making a separate point.
A separate point from the other point. Okay.
So you guys want to get into the article?
Yeah, sure. That sounds good.
Yeah. So here's the first quote. The reality is that America has a college completion crisis. Among traditionally aged bachelor's degree students, the U.S. Department of Education reports that only 59% graduate within 6 years, never mind 4. For students in 2-year institutions, completion rates are even lower. Put those numbers together, and a majority of American students who enter college do not complete their degrees in the time allotted, or indeed ever. Yeah,
when I was in University of Wisconsin, it was like the #1 party score or whatever, and like there were people in their freshman, it was like notorious, and people in the freshman year like dropped out. Like 40% of them dropped out because they didn't ever show up to class because they were hungover or something.
well, I mean, that actually would. So going into this a little bit more, not talking about specifics, but a lot of people don't drop out their senior year; they drop out after their freshman year or sophomore year.
Right.
Which 59% and 40, like that's actually probably not too far off.
Yeah.
And obviously, some schools have different dropout rates than others.
Yeah,
Like if
totally.
you look at certain schools, I'm sure their dropout rates are 10 or 15%.
Or close to 0 here, I think.
Yeah, I
pretty
mean,
low,
I mean, obviously it's not 0, and then it's also a measurement like do not graduate within 6 years, like dropout rate versus like ineligible rate,
Right,
like,
right.
or transfer rate. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
It
definitely.
gets. I don't know exactly how this is defined, but
Yeah, and it's hard to follow his stats a little bit, but
yeah.
So a broader question is, this is really framed as a problem.
yeah, I was gonna break this down.
Yeah, go ahead.
So it might be a problem, but like there's different categories of what could be going on. So
Yeah.
like one category is that like it is not worth starting college, even doing like 1 semester of college and paying for it, unless you're going to finish it based on social and economic benefits. And so people are getting it wrong en masse. That's like one possibility, and I think it's the possibility he's implying in this article because he's framing it as a big problem.
I see.
But
view it as a
another
problem, but
another possibility, I don't actually know which of these it is, but just to break it into different possibilities, another possibility is that like paying a little bit of money to get the first-hand information about what college actually is, which you don't have before you started, and kind of how you do in college and like all of that is actually kind of a worthwhile sort of risk-benefit trade-off that a lot of people are making before they decide whether to continue invest money in it and keep on
They
going.
can always have like a shadow program where they
Right.
follow a student around for like a week or something like
But it
that.
might be
Yeah,
hard to
so
get as
that's-
much.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, a third-
so what do you think,
Hold,
David?
hold
Oh,
on.
yeah, go
A
ahead.
third possibility is that there are other benefits people are getting that they accrue simply in the first semester of college. I'm skeptical of this now, but like when my grandmother went to college, she dropped out because she found a husband, which was the reason she was there in the first place. So there might be some of that going on, like some kind of networking or people like dating someone, or I mean that might still be part of like something that people get out of college that they don't need the full years or like the degree to get. So those are like 3 different options that kind of came to mind for me. And I
Yeah.
don't really know which predominate. in
Yeah.
this
What do you
situation.
think, David?
Yeah, what do you think?
So basically, my thing is, I think that some percentage of those people should never have been admitted to college. They were never going to be able to complete college. Like, they're not capable of that level of mental rigor, quite frankly, or at least not the college they applied to. Like, just because you got in does not mean you are actually capable of.
So you think the college is sort of maybe prioritizing profit or something else over like
Well, I mean, there's definitely some colleges that are, but
Yeah,
I mean, they're actually for profit. So
Right,
let's
right.
take those aside and say, but there are some colleges that will say, well, we have all of these PhDs in, whatever, English Lit, so let's make English Lit a required freshman course. And, yes, some people will drop out after, but, we issue them, so we should employ them. So it's kind of the college industrial complex, basically, rather than the military industrial complex.
So you think the incentive is like kind of justifying the existence of the sort of graduate programs and other things?
Yeah.
Interesting.
And not to say that that is the actual conscious choice anyone is making.
Is
Right.
it like so? What is it? Those who can't do it teach or something?
No. It's some of these degrees are actually only applicable for teaching, really.
Mm-hmm.
Like, there's no other use of them. So they're issuing, let's say Harvard issues, 10 degrees in English Lit, math, PhDs in English Lit every year, and the only thing you can do with a PhD in English Lit is teach English Lit.
No, I understand what you're saying.
Like, Harvard's, issuing 10 of these, Yale's issuing 12, all these schools, and you end up with 500 people graduating with PhDs in English Lit every year, and how many job openings are there to teach English Lit?
But you still have to
At the
explain
college level, because you don't get your PhD to teach at the high school level.
No, right. But you still have to explain kind of like why it's not a collective action problem that's failing. Because you don't necessarily, unless everyone's hiring their own PhDs.
Well, a lot of people are.
Which some
actually,
people are, yeah.
The University of Connecticut education program hires like I think they literally hired one person a couple of years ago who didn't get their PhD in education from the University of Connecticut education program.
Right, but they probably gave a lot more of those degrees than they were able to hire anyway
Yeah.
because of the number of.
Yeah, and those people went other places. Some people probably were, SOL, quite frankly,
Right.
because they overbuilt out the program for the actual demand.
Right. If you get your PhD at Harvard, you can teach at some other university, but if you get your PhD at that other university, you're not teaching anywhere, kind of.
Basically.
A lot of times, yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
What do you think is going on with this?
So I think it's funny that we think of this as a problem. And I think there are reasons why it makes sense that people think of it as a problem, especially because people are borrowing, and in order to pay back a lot of that debt, they have to finish through to the degree and stuff like that. But generally speaking, I don't think it should be a problem that you got some education and then went in another direction. Like I think there's something wrong with the system if this is a problem. If it's a problem that people learn a little bit and then, yeah, go ahead.
That makes sense to me. But I guess from the perspective of the university, it's kind of like how if Dan, my advisor, takes a grad student and then the grad student drops out, he doesn't really get that slot back, and nobody else can have that slot. So
right. So I mean, a question is the university really the right way to educate people, right? So I mean, like, if we think about MOOCs, right? Like, these are free online courses, and you can, there's a completion rate of 5% for each course, or maybe even lower, or something like that. But I mean, for me, I learn a lot, and maybe I sign up for 10 courses and complete one of them, or something like that. And, it's just a matter of, following what I'm interested in. And that's not a problem.
Right.
But the reason that this is a problem is because we've structured the system in such a way that there are certain expectations, and those expectations are also tied in with financial commitments.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, yeah. We don't think of it as a big problem when people drop out of MOOCs.
Right. And then there was also the thing that that David brought up, which is that maybe some people don't have the what it takes to be in college in the first place. So is it a problem that they got admitted to the college, or is it a problem that getting admitted to the college and then not finishing is screwing them over so much, right? Maybe I feel like it wouldn't be a problem to have a system where, a bunch of people go in and, try it out, decide that it's not for them, and then don't continue. But we can't have that system when people are kind of in debt in order to get there in the first place, and they have to pay back that debt using the degree.
Right. That's definitely true. And your mom's also pointing out something else, which is as much as we love MOOCs, there are benefits, especially for certain types of individuals, to more interactive or hands-on teaching or more structure.
Yeah, and she brought up in-person interactions earlier, and I think that's right. But MOOCs are not incompatible with that, right? MOOCs are kind of the content that's been designed, that's been expertly designed, and all of that. There's no reason why you can't have a human interaction, an in-person interaction layer on top of that.
No, but sorry, go ahead.
There's no reason why you can't have say a group, someone who you pay to get a group of people together to help them through the MOOC and facilitate that learning process.
Right.
It doesn't have to be what we have now as a college or
but
university.
To make it free, or one of the nice things about MOOCs is once you have them, and they do take a lot of money to develop, you can distribute them to a lot of people with minimal or no cost per person. But with hands-on teaching, especially if they're a good an expert or a skilled teacher, or really knowledgeable in the field, that's going, or even if they're not, there's resources happening there that aren't sort of just easy to just distribute to everyone or free.
Sure, but it can still be a lot cheaper. There's a difference, there's a huge difference between having no in-person attention and then the in-person attention of someone who's good at facilitating people but might not be an expert in the particular subject or the world's foremost expert in that particular subject. There's a huge jump there, and it's much huger than the jump between having that facilitator, even though they're teaching the best content or facilitating you through the best content, and having the actual person who created that content being there facilitating you. There's not as much of a leap there.
But hold on, Richard,
Actually, in China, they have a shortage of people who say are fluent English speakers who are good at teaching. So they actually have MOOC type courses for elementary school students and things that.
That's interesting.
And so they use their better there's telecommunicating type programs. I actually had something like that when I was in college,
Interesting.
where they had like a political science. I took 2 political science courses,
Right.
and like this like gemstone course because I needed
Right.
it for.
Yeah.
And so I had a professor somewhere else, and then they taught some people at my campus and whatnot.
Right.
Yeah,
I
and
guess-
there's some elementary schools here in the United States where they're trying out having the kids go through like Khan Academy modules,
Right.
and each kid kind of has his own pace and his own direction, and then the teachers can keep track of like which modules each kid has completed in a spreadsheet, and then kind of like direct them to the next thing, and it gives a lot more possibilities for
That's cool.
for personalized learning, and there's still the in-person element.
And
Yeah.
in Africa, they actually have they've handed out tablets that have all the math courses on it, and they actually have a single teacher for all that walk around and if anyone
Right.
asks any questions.
That's
And
cool.
so everyone has their own custom speeds
That's
and
awesome.
whatever
Yeah.
for the.
That's really cool.
Yeah.
Sultan's here, by the way.
Hey, Sultan.
I think this all kind of comes back to your other question, Alex, of like, what is the goal of this education? Because I guess before
Right.
I can answer like how much in-person, communication or discussion leading is important, how important it is to have someone who's really knowledgeable doing that. It kind of depends on the goal of the whole enterprise and what people are supposed to be learning. And
That was mostly a comment about how expensive it would be, right? So you can always pay a premium, a really, really high premium to get, the rock star, educator to be the one to educate you or something like that. But that doesn't mean that we can't get a lot of gains that are much cheaper and easier for people to access that don't provide a lot of that benefit without actually having that person
right, but I guess I'm saying
directly.
like how much we care about the part that we lose kind of depends on our goals.
I'm talking about what we gain, right? So there's always going to be people who have access to the best professors, one-on-one access, that kind of thing. But I'm talking about the people who don't have that access. Now you have MOOCs, right? And now you have, ways to learn from the best professors that might not be as perfect as if you were sitting down with them one-on-one and picking their brain and they had all the time in the world for you, but that are pretty good and much better than what you could have gotten before. But people can't afford to do it because it doesn't get them the college degree, or they don't have the time to do it because they need to spend their time working or something like that.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Actually, there are like graduate courses where there's or courses where they have an AI program that answers people's questions and people they spent like a whole semester and they weren't able to figure out there was an AI program that was answering all their questions.
That's funny.
for
What
them.
subject was it?
I don't.
It was actually an AI class.
Oh, interesting.
No, I'm just kidding.
No. You're the joke.
It was a class in the Turing test.
Yeah, right.
Right, yeah.
It was very meta class.
The only clue that they had was that the answers were so like pretty much instantaneously after they asked
Right.
them. That's the only way.
They should have added a delay if they wanted to trick
Yeah.
people. Yeah, that's funny.
So Rick says, don't most MOOCs offer graded credentials if you decide to pay? So the purpose of this education is still profit. Do you think UBI will change this? So I think that's an interesting point. I think, well, first of all, when we talk about the profit motive, the purpose of doing something for people might be because they'll pay you for it. But so there's that purpose, the purpose that the provider has. But then there's also the purpose that the client has or the purpose that the student has. So the purpose of the student, is, we were talking about before, maybe you get an education now or you get the credential now so you can get the profit later, that kind of thing. But in the presence of a UBI, people might see really interesting things that they want to learn, and maybe they're willing to pay for that, or maybe they don't care about the credential as much because they know they're financially secure and it's just a really interesting thing to learn, so they won't pay to get the extra credential. Like there might be less incentive to actually pay for that part of it because it's not part of your education. It's just like you paid some money and then you got a little certificate that you can show off or something like that.
I guess an analogy would be just like people buying, if you just like bought a bunch of books in an area that you were interested in but wasn't your career or anything like that, people do that. So that's an example of like purchasing something just because you want to learn it. We see that now.
Yeah.
I mean, books are easier to get kind of like for free now, but before that,
Yeah.
like my friend Josh would buy like a ton of chess books just to play chess, or like a ton of history books. He's interested in
Right.
that. But so I guess I'm saying even paying for a MOOC, or even if it wasn't like a free online class, but paying for like a cheap
Yeah.
online class could be like that if it wasn't related to your career stuff.
Yeah.
In terms of the purpose of the student.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and I think it's important to keep in mind what the purpose of profit itself is. The purpose of profit is to get people to do things for you that they wouldn't ordinarily do. So if I pay Bethany to do something for me, then she's more likely to do it for me. If I'm paying, like if there's an educator who's not going to educate unless you pay him, then the purpose of that profit is to incentivize that person to do the thing. And that's true of profit in general. It's you offer profit in order to get the person to do the thing. So it's less that, so the person is doing the thing partially for profit, but the reason the profit is there is because there are other people who want that product, who want that service.
I've heard about recently about how these assistant professors and things like that, they need to get their foot in the door, so they teach for less than it is to live in the area where they're teaching, and so they have to take on jobs to like Uber and things like that to make ends meet. So.
Well, a lot of adjunct professors pay very little. Like that's actually
Right.
pretty common.
Yeah.
Like they take it in hopes of becoming tenured, and once they're tenured, they'll build a reputation and make more money. Like, that's kind of also part of what I'm gonna keep calling the educational industrial complex, where it's like it's
Right.
just overbuilt.
Yeah, I mean, it's also the case that there are certain jobs that people want to do because they really enjoy spending their time that way.
Right.
So sometimes they're willing to take a pay cut in order to do that kind of job. So, we hear about teachers being paid very little or adjunct professors being paid very little. And that's what you would expect, because these are the kinds of things that,
Right.
all else being equal, people would really want to do.
Yeah.
So that in order to make it
this is
so
what I
that,
do with my life. Like
Right.
I'm a lecturer and I get paid more than most adjuncts, but like I could get paid way more at some other job, but I wouldn't
Right.
have the time flexibility. I wouldn't be doing what I want to do. I
Right.
wouldn't have total creative control over everything I do and get to do like this super interesting job
Right.
with these great students. So it's like, if there were a basic income, I probably wouldn't get paid anything, because all the people like me would be willing to do it for free.
right,
So,
exactly.
so part of it is like whether people require, like you're saying, like money to like incentivize them to do it.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think there's this misconception that people need to be paid based on the value they're creating or something like that. But really, there's kind of this other dimension of if something is valuable to the worker to do as well, then you would expect it to be paid less.
Yeah.
Otherwise, everyone's going to do that thing because it pays the same as the thing nobody wants to do. So then everyone's a teacher or something like
Yeah,
that.
and this is like
Yeah.
that paradox where like often these things are really like valuable, and that's part of why people want to do them, and so they do pay less.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's interesting.
So Sultan says UBI would be helpful for the ones who want to change their career path.
Mhm.
They could stay at home to educate themselves without working. So there would be happier professionals.
Yeah, that's a good point.
I think that's a really good point. And something we bring up in here sometimes is the idea that if you have a basic income, then people have more freedom to choose not to work or not to work at a particular job. So then that filters out all the people who don't really want to be there, who are only kind of there because they have to be, because they don't have to be anymore. Now your remaining workforce is more motivated, more productive, and all of that.
Yeah.
And I think that would kind of be true across the board. And you see obviously a greater effect the greater the basic income is.
I think I like Rick's point.
Yeah.
Too, below that is an interesting question. Like,
Do you want to read it?
yeah, he says, I agree with her. I'm not sure if it's Sultan or one of your mom's comments or something we said, but he says, because people can decide to learn anything at any time, but most do not outside of the profit motive. So I'm assuming you mean, Rick, like now currently people could be doing like a lot of MOOCs and stuff like that, but like only a minority of people maybe do that. And he's saying like, he's wondering, realistically, how do you see UBI affecting education?
Yeah. So, I mean, the way I see UBI affecting education is kind of the way I see it affecting everything. So it gives people a lot more freedom to spend their time how they choose. So I feel like it would give people a lot more freedom to follow their own intellectual path without necessarily restricting themselves based on the need for the credential. And that's not to say that we shouldn't also have resources in place to help people along their paths. I'm not saying just kind of drop everything and let, like, there should be institutions in place that help support people, but it's a lot easier to have those things in place if people have the freedom to kind of follow their own path in their own direction. So if you've got a ton of people who are all you've got more intellectuals, more academics who are maybe not, they don't fit into the existing university college system, but you've got people who are choosing to live in that role. Now you've got all kinds of more thinking and collaboration, more ideas flowing, and I think, you know, you would see a proliferation of intellectual material, educational material, and then, you know, like businesses that want to organize that material and curate it for people, and just kind of like this whole possibility of this new education for intellectual pursuit, rather than trying to filter people into jobs and careers.
Right. And I guess in addition to that, I think what Rick might be raising is like there might be fewer people who get education, period. Like a lot of people who go to college now for the profit motive, like to get a good job, but like incidentally maybe learn a bunch of stuff or not, I don't know, depending on the situation. Like they're maybe just going to not do any of that. And
So
are you okay with that, I guess?
I think there's going to be a lot fewer people going to college. I think there's going to be a lot more people getting educated. I think that you know, like a lot of people don't have the freedom to educate themselves. They don't have the money and they don't have the time. With basic income, people can spend their time how they choose. Some of them might choose to play video games and smoke pot or whatever, and that's fine. But what's really, and well, I say that's fine, you know, maybe we need, you know, systems in place to help support these people, make sure they're actually truly happy in their lives and you know, whatnot. But I think for the people who really, you know, we don't know how many Einsteins are pumping gas and how many Mozarts are, you know, like collecting your trash. And 3. Yeah. Well, I guess David knew. Yeah. But for those people, they have an opportunity, and we can unlock the human potential that's there, and I think there's a lot of it. So there's that question. There's the question of unlocking the human potential, which I really think basic income would help us do. And then there's the question of, for the people who aren't very self-motivated, how do we help them get the most out of life? And that's, you know, somewhat of a separate question, but basic income, of course, gives us the opportunity to face this challenge and explore this problem and to try to come up with creative solutions.
Yeah, I guess just to kind of like summarize a couple of the things that you said. I mean, one argument is that like people should have the freedom to do what they want, and if what they want is not to learn, well, that's I mean, you're giving people freedom, so they don't always do what you want them to do. And a second point that you're making is like 1 or 2 out of 1,000 people who do something really great with this that benefits a whole lot of the rest of us might be worth the rest of the people getting a little bit less education than they had before in terms of just sort of social output. So that may or may not be true.
Right. I think there's 2 concerns that we have about the people who aren't educating themselves. And one is that bad for the rest of us? And the answer is no. You know, like the people who we want doing the work.
People who deny climate change or don't want vaccines or.
Right. So the people who we want participating in intellectual discourse are the people who really want to be there, who are the people who are really inspired, right? If there are people who are not inspired and they you know are not interested in, you know, participating in the debates or contributing, you know, to academics or to any intellectual anything, you know, that's not bad for the rest of us. But it might be bad for them if they feel, you know, purposelessness in their life, if they don't.
Sorry. I mean, go ahead. But
I mean, like, so there's the concern of how it affects other people, and it's not a problem. Like I was saying with the labor force, if the people who aren't motivated aren't the workers, then everyone else is better off. And it's the same thing with academia.
I think that Richard was pointing to maybe a bit of a counterpoint here, which is like maybe we don't need those people in specific jobs or in specific intellectual fields, but maybe we want a populace maybe there's other benefits to be had to a populace that can understand pretty sophisticated things, like how to understand research on vaccines and whether they cause autism. And for that, maybe we need people to get educated, and like what level. Like,
I
go ahead.
have an example.
Right.
A few days ago, I finished Veep, and which is on HBO, and there's this one character who's partially portrayed based on Trump, named Jonah. Who?
No, he's not based on Trump. The character existed way before that, Richard. Stop being biased.
His campaigns run like Trump.
Mm.
And he's he purposely did his campaign stops in the shape of like a penis or something like that, and he somehow along the way caught like chicken pox, and so all these people who are like anti-vaxxers, like he spreads chicken pox to all these people along this way, and they're like, do they still not believe in vaccines, even though they have all this proof, all these cases of chicken pox along this exact path?
So I think this is actually not going to be a problem, and the reason why is that part of why people believe these things is because there are people who are trying to make their name as experts. And these are people who, if we had a basic income, they are not necessarily going to be motivated to do that kind of work.
I'm not following.
Yeah, so let's talk about the anti-vax guy. Like, he was a scientist. Right. Do we think that someone who had such poor, scientific rigor would be inspired to be a scientist if he had more freedom not to? Right?
So I think the point I'm trying to make is a lot broader.
I think it's because he wanted the prestige. He wanted his name out there. Some people just, they don't care about the degree or whatever so much as they want to become famous, even if it's infamous.
It's also deeply within humans. Like, you see it in many small-scale societies, certain kinds of magical thinking that seem to take a certain kind of education to overcome. So I don't think it's just about one person trying to make a name for himself. And
I think that's right. But in terms of kind of like legitimizing some of these debates, you would see less of it.
So I guess here's
and there's
my question.
also with like climate change, there's the profit motive.
I was going to bring that up too. Yeah, sorry, keep going. Yeah, good point.
Where they knew back in like the 70s that, well, David, he was talking about it at a party a few years ago about how they knew about this stuff, and so, well, David's like, about in the 70s, so I recommended they don't pay out any of the damages after the 70s.
Richard, no.
It's okay.
No. Don't talk.
No.
You're conflating my statement, and you're actually talking about a legal matter, and I'd really not appreciate it if you don't talk about, or I really appreciate if you don't discuss such a thing. You're conflating a statement. You're incorrect in what I'm talking about, or what I was discussing, and this is not the venue.
Well, I think the general point I agree with, though, which is like that sometimes the misinformation isn't about trying to make a name for yourself intellectually. Right. Sometimes it's about profit, like with the oil industry and that kind of thing.
And I think if more people have the freedom to kind of explore these things more deeply and understand them more deeply, then you're going to see less of the spread of this kind of stuff.
I guess I wanted to raise the
I think I mean, like, I'm not saying this is all of it, but I think there's a huge contributing factor of people not having the resources to think deeply, not having the time or energy to think deeply about things, and just going with their gut based on what feels right to them.
So with some of these political things, it's a side. There are other things going on. For example, sometimes when you're more educated, you're more biased because it's really about your incentives and not about your education. So that's kind of like one point that I want to not talk about directly. I wanted to raise the question instead of like what kinds of education we really think people need to have independent of jobs, just to be like helping our society function really well and helping our political system function really well. And, I think that's a pretty high degree. And I guess that's kind of the role of education that is mandated up to 12th grade, but we haven't really talked about like, that kind of education.
And I mean, yet. I think that's right. I mean, I don't see there being like a problem in society if a lot of people aren't educated in that way, like a problem to everyone else. But I do think that there are certain things that everybody kind of needs to learn that are kind of in common that will help them get the most out of life. Right. Like if nobody speaks English, if nobody can talk to each other, then we don't have a society.
But I also disagree that these don't affect all of the rest of us. Like if I live in a society where most people don't understand anything about economics or anything about how to evaluate health data, like my society is worse.
You already live in that society.
Well, if it got worse, it'd be worse, and if it got better, it'd be better for me. So it's not just about individual people. I also agree, like there's individual people getting the most out of their lives, but you were claiming it doesn't affect other people, and I think it does.
Yeah, I mean, like, I don't think most people need to understand economics. I don't think most people need to understand health data. I do think the experts need to understand it. And I do think people need the freedom to become experts if they want to. And I think that's something that basic income helps with.
When I was in high school, people had the option of opting out of sex ed for like religious reasons and things like that. And so I'm not sure how many people actually like went to study hall during that. Or didn't go to the class at all, and so like that was like probably like abstinence only people in like Texas and whatnot, and they actually have higher rates of STDs and more teenage pregnancies and things where they have in like Texas and whatnot because of the ignorance that is allowed to prevail because they are allowed to opt out of classes and things that don't agree with their religious views or
like anti-vaxxers like Washington has measles. Other states don't have measles because other states don't like, arbitrarily object to getting a measles vaccine.
So these things definitely affect all of us.
Well, anti-vaxxers is terrible, and we're talking about whether these things would kind of improve under basic income or whether there'd be something happening where now, since people have more freedom, it would make it worse or something like that. Yeah.
Well, I mean, I guess I was just raising the question of what kinds of education we feel should be required of everyone.
I think there's basic things like language and basic arithmetic and stuff like that everybody needs to learn. And I don't think everybody needs to learn health statistics or the theory behind vaccination per se, but they do need to learn that vaccination is important, and they need to they either have to trust that it is, or they have to go deeper and learn the other stuff. Like those are the two options.
Hold on. I don't know if I would go so far as to say need, but like it's highly socially beneficial for people to have this higher degree of like understanding because something new is going to come on.
You can say that.
You can have like just make it compulsory to get your basic income. You need to get a measles vaccine.
Wait a second.
I think that's a bad idea.
You're getting into something that is very, very dangerous there, Richard. Actually putting like a requirement on people for something like that is no.
That's what they do for both the familial things.
Well,
and I think it's a mistake.
Yeah, I significantly disagree with that idea. Like, I think that is dangerous and cruel in some cases. There are like it's hard to document exemptions to it because there are actually people who can't get certain vaccines because of like an actual allergy. They make some vaccines now allergy free, but not all of them. That is a very dangerous path.
So I guess the question related.
I mean, like obviously you could accommodate for that if you've demonstrated.
Then you're building out a giant architecture to accommodate for all the rules you're putting in place, and you're
right. Yep. Go ahead.
I guess the question, as it relates to basic income, and not just kind of like what do we want the high school curriculum to be, is like would we lose out on anything in terms of an educated populace that we're worried about with the potentially lower incentive to go to college with a basic income?
I think no.
And I guess I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I think we gain a lot, and I also I feel pretty strongly that college is not the best way to educate most people. I feel very strongly about that, and I think if we had a basic income, our education infrastructure would evolve in a way that makes it look very, very different from what we have today.
Right. I also think we could do better with education through 12th grade, so that like most of the things that I'm concerned about, I mean, 18-year-olds, 17-year-olds can grasp most of these concepts.
Yeah. And I think that's right too. And I think there's a problem in that a lot of our high school education is preparing for people for jobs and preparing people for colleges.
Right.
And if there wasn't as much of that anymore, you could start to put in more interesting, more useful other things in that space.
Yeah, that's interesting.
And like I think it would be cool if everybody had the opportunity to learn economics in high school. I think that would be awesome. But it's important to keep in mind that we could come up with any number of things that feel very, very important to us. And there are things that are very, very important to other people that we don't know and things like that. It's hard to, come up with the core set of things that some things are easy, but then like it very quickly, you have to decide, do they learn this thing or do they learn that thing and that kind of stuff.
It's challenging, but yeah, go ahead.
It is challenging, but the thing that's cool about giving people more freedom to learn different things is that even if not everybody is learning about medical statistics and the arguments behind vaccines and all of that, you can have more people knowing about each of those things, even if each one of them is not something that everybody learns. And the people who really want to know and the people who really care, including the people who tend to become anti-vaxxers, can have more resources at their disposal to learn about this stuff.
Yeah, I mean, I'm generally a fan of freedom, but like I do think you're assuming something that a little quickly, like, I mean, maybe you're right, but you're assuming that people will end up more educated on average, maybe even with like most people not having the financial incentive to go to college. And I guess what like I'm thinking about is like that's an assumption, and it's not really obvious. Like it could be that people don't have much intrinsic desire to educate themselves on really anything without this financial incentive. And
going to college and educating yourself is not the same thing.
Well, but people pick up some education along the way. So I'm just saying that you make an assumption here. Like you make an assumption and it could end up another way. And I think that's what Rick thinks. I don't think that's, at least based on some of his early comments. I don't know if you're still there, Rick, but I don't necessarily agree with that. But I'm just, for the sake of being like transparent, it's possible that without the financial incentive, people don't go to college, they don't educate themselves on their own either, and you have a slightly less educated populace than you had before. Yeah, I mean, it's hard to imagine that reality. And the reason it's hard to imagine that reality is because we can look at the world we live in and we can see all the things that are holding people back, all the disincentives or all the barriers in the way of people educating themselves. And that is so massive that it's hard to imagine that removing those barriers isn't going to have a much greater effect than, like taking away the incentive for people to go to college because they're desperate and they need the credential. Well, right? I'm mostly with you, but again, a very cynical person about human motivation to learn could say that, like, yeah, you're removing the barriers, but you're also removing all of the motivation. I don't think you are, but somebody could argue that. I'd be interested in seeing how they argue that. It doesn't feel plausible to me. Well, I guess you'd have to try to look at historical examples, and you'd have to, I mean, it's tough. Historical examples of people who didn't have to do this or that, and did they pursue education? So what I look at is, kind of the aristocracy in ancient Greece and ancient Rome and places like that. And obviously there were plenty of members of the aristocracy that didn't do anything useful, and we don't hear about them. Our history books talk about Aristotle and Plato and all of that. But
Sir Isaac Newton,
like all of the really most of the meaningful advances in human progress, human intellectual discovery, all of that came from the aristocracy, and that was very, very, very tiny percentage of the population was a member of the aristocracy. With basic income, you can essentially do the equivalent of making everyone a part of the aristocracy. The freedom that they had could be the freedom that everyone has. So even if you imagine a world in which fewer people are educating themselves, I don't think it's reasonable to argue that you wouldn't have kind of an explosion in human innovation and creativity by expanding this to everyone.
I mean, just again, like I generally agree with you, but Rick doesn't. So I was just kind of trying to give the opposite point some voice here, and I think it is actually a separate question whether you would end up with like you could have a much less educated populace in more innovation because you have like a very small number of people innovating more.
Yeah. So Rick says that the majority of people are more like dogs than Einstein. I think that's hard to demonstrate one way or the other. It's hard to like definitively prove. But what we can know is that a very tiny percentage of people were able to make all of these amazing contributions. And if you give 100% of people the freedom to do that, say you go from 1% to 100%, now you're multiplying that by 100.
You are. Although,
regardless of whether most people are more like dogs than Einstein.
To be fair, though, there might have been something particular about the incentive structure and the social structure of the aristocracy at that particular point in time that led like to so many people over those centuries pursuing intellectual things
at that particular point in time.
Well, I mean, it's called the Enlightenment for a reason, but like over those centuries there might have been something going on. That I guess all I'm saying
let's talk about
like,
ancient Greece too.
Well,
anytime there's an aristocracy.
All I'm saying is like there might be conditions in addition to like freedom that we need to have in place to get those kinds of results.
Sure. Yeah, okay.
And those conditions may or may not be in place now. They might be,
They may or may not be in place now. Well, you at least need freedom, right? If you don't have the freedom to pursue intellectual stuff, then you're not going to do it, right? Like that's at least a necessary condition.
Right, but there might be others, is all I'm saying. like
what?
Like the people like religious, Galileo. He was in prison because he questioned a lot of different Catholic beliefs about how the world was this way and whatnot.
Well, that's an issue of freedom, right?
Yeah, there's all sorts of intellectual freedom things. Yeah. You might also need you might need it to be like valued and respected in your culture and your environment and among your peers. Right. And I don't know quite how that goes.
So you're saying that you could have like a basic income with financial security and all of that and the freedom that provides without also having intellectual freedom, and then there's a problem there.
That or without having motivation based on kind of your peers, or without having the resources you need to do the research, or there's kind of like a bunch of other things.
Yeah, I mean, all of these things are freedom related. Basic income, it gives you access to resources. So whatever resources we have, they become available when you have the money to buy them, right? Yeah. Yep. Okay.
Were there any points or quotes you really wanted to make sure today?
Well, let's get to another one.
Yeah.
Okay. But without a degree, these students do not receive the economic reward they expected. Worse, those who begin a degree program and take on debt but do not finish are left with the burden of paying back loans, worse off than when they started. So, I mean, I just selected this quote because it's very interesting that people are going to college expecting an economic reward. And I think that goes against kind of educating people. It goes against the goal of educating people as well as possible.
It's interesting, because like you kind of still have the ethos in at least some universities that people are there to learn and to learn for learning's sake. So you do end up kind of sometimes having these conflicts. Like if people are ultimately there for an economic payoff, then they're not really aligned with the goals of the instructors or the institution while they are there. That can happen.
Yeah.
Actually, in the University of Wisconsin, the outgoing governor, Scott Walker, he was a dropout of the University of Wisconsin. He actually had changed the purpose, the direction or whatever of the University of Wisconsin, where he had teaching towards the program. And it,
teaching towards the program?
Well, I'll give you an example. We'll teach engineering, but we're not going to teach any of the humanities, which would deal with the consequences of building an AI or whatever. So we'll just create an AI, but we're not going to say.
So what was he trying to do? What did he want?
Teaching towards having programs directed towards
careers.
More career focused. Okay. Interesting. Yeah.
All right. So let's go to another one.
I got
institutions are failing to help their students successfully navigate the path to a degree. Yet, because college students are presumed to be adults, and because college is an expensive personal investment, the public and the government typically begin from the presumption that students are solely responsible for their own success or failure. How you doing, Bethany?
I'm super curious what it's like in other institutions, I guess. But I'm trying to square this with something Andrew Yang actually pointed out, which is that a lot of the rise in college costs actually has to do with the rise in administrators. And at least part of what all these administrators are supposedly doing is helping navigate the process. Like, there's a ton at Harvard. I mean, there's like endless advisors at Harvard, and it just seems like there's no end to the hunger for saying that there should be more advisors. And like, not that they aren't helpful, but it's like, it's certainly not the case here, and this might be like the exception, I don't know, but it's certainly not the case here that students are expected to navigate on their own. In fact, there's a whole bunch of other people complaining exactly of the opposite of this guy, that like students are over coddled, which I don't necessarily think that's how, but like, he didn't give any information or like examples even, let alone like statistics to back this up. So I was just left very unsatisfied because I have only my one example here, which doesn't match it at all. And I wasn't able to really figure out if like this is actually true at all. And he didn't really support it at all.
So I think there's this problem of institutions hiring more administrators, which leads to tuitions being higher, which leads to students taking out more debt, which means it's more costly.
More out of it. Yeah, exactly.
Which means it's more costly if they drop out partway through, which means they need more administrators to help them make it through.
I mean,
and,
part
et cetera.
of the problem is the cost, which and part of the cost problem is all these people trying to help you through. I mean, so.
And I think all of this problem goes away if we're no longer expecting people to get a degree. We're no longer expecting people to make it through. It's gone. This problem just evaporates. And if people aren't going into debt in order to go to college, this problem is gone as well.
Right. I think
there's no way you can be worse off than when you started if you didn't have this setup where you borrow.
So I suspect there'll still be a market for institutions where they do offer like maybe the residential or at least like the in-person teaching experience, and those institutions will cost something, and that those institutions might have a selection process and kind of want to retain their students once they get there. So I don't know that problem will like completely go away.
That's different from having a society in which people have to do this. People feel like they have to do this in order to live a decent life, and they don't really have a choice.
Right. I think the point that follows from my other point is like, I actually think more of the action will be on like who never maybe applies for college in the first place when it's maybe not as essential for getting a job, which is a little bit to your point earlier about like people getting in and not really being qualified. Like, I think some of those people might self-select out, or qualified, or just interested, or whatever. Yeah. I don't know.
Let's do one more.
It also, I guess, sorry, just one more thing. It also raised like one other point, which is like how much of the function of current colleges is offering a certain kind of living environment where you meet different kind of people, have certain kinds of activities, and there's this whole question of like, how valuable is that? What would replace that if people aren't doing that as much? That kind of thing.
Yeah, I think that's right. There's a lot to college besides just what's on paper vis-a-vis education.
Besides the cost of like administrators, when I was the year I graduated, they actually voted. There was a vote on whether they would build another facility. Like, they tear down the one student union building and build a more green one or whatever, and it was actually voted down because it would increase the cost of university, and so there's, and I read another article that said that there's they want more luxurious things, so that's going part of one of the reasons where the riot of increasing tuition costs and things.
Interesting.
Yeah, I mean, there's all kinds of these dynamics that don't really need to be there in a successful education system if we're educating for the purpose of kind of enriching people's minds and preparing them for a life of engagement with the world, right, rather than trying to funnel them into the job market. So Rick has a comment. How much does the feeling of necessity and fear of failure drive youth to succeed in achieving great things? Maybe a little. It's possible UBI removes that drive and we have less Einsteins, not more. So I don't think that's possible. And yeah.
Well, it's possible.
Is it possible? So the idea, an analogy I like to give is that in Vietnam, the soldiers who enlisted voluntarily were much more effective than the ones who were drafted.
But he is talking
Yeah.
about what leads someone to enlist voluntarily. He's not talking about being forced.
Well, he's talking about them being forced to enlist voluntarily, right? So
well, but I mean, I think we don't know what drives people to be in the end self-motivated, to be really successful. Like,
right,
that's
because
kind
even
of what
self-motivation comes from somewhere,
yeah,
that kind of
he's
thing.
calling that into question here.
Yeah.
I actually read that people who like enlist themselves get the choice of where they want to be and whatnot, and are more likely to be promoted and things.
That's true. So I think, yeah. So I mean,
that doesn't get into the fraud with it though.
Yeah. To the extent that UBI removes that drive, I mean, I can imagine individual people being motivated by having lost a father, and because you have UBI, you know, there's less poverty and your father lives or something like that, or less crime. But yeah, and I mean, that could be an issue, and there could be the question of how do you motivate people in the world in general. It doesn't change the fact that in order for the market economy to function properly, people need spending money.
Right.
So, you know, like, we could be asking these questions about what happens in the context of UBI, but it's important to remember that none of these are arguments against UBI. You still need a functioning market economy. You still need people spending money in order to buy things. And the alternatives to UBI are pretty bad, like making up useless work for people to do and forcing them to do it, taking away their freedom, forcing more borrowing in the private financial sector to keep consumer spending up, and all of that kind of stuff. So I think it generally is true, to kind of give Rick a little bit of credit to his point, that in a world with UBI, we're going to have lots of interesting challenges to face. And I'm skeptical that this is one of them, but it could be, and there are definitely going to be other challenges, and that's really exciting.
Right. And I guess one point to how you think about UBI is like the labor market, like money could still incentivize people to be Einsteins too. You suspect that a lot of people are going to like go off and do it on their own, but it doesn't preclude, if we find that people are unmotivated, for that to be something that is incentivized via money, like everything else.
Like the MacArthur Genius.
Well, sure. Yeah, of course.
So you know,
so
that's an option.
Let's go around and get final thoughts. Bethany.
Yeah. So I guess I'm still kind of interested in like how much of the higher education system would persist or not as in the form that it is in now with the UBI, and also with like other technological innovations like MOOCs and other things that we've been talking about. I'm also kind of interested in this question of, you know, having an educated populace in a way that's beneficial for everyone, and how do you do that in a way that's actually scalable, that doesn't take away too much of people's freedom. Is kind of like a challenging question for me. Sometimes can seem like a really daunting question.
Right.
When I think about how much I would want someone to know to be able to vote, which is way more than I even know, and I'm one of the most educated people in the country by conventional standards. So anyway.
Yeah, David.
I strongly just look at this and think that it's just like the military industrial complex. It's an overbuilt mechanism that facilitates certain things that aren't necessarily what people actually need out of college or want out of college or should be getting out of college. And the whole crisis issue is partly perpetuated by those secondary things. Like Richard was saying with the UW-Madison voting down something, it's like, well, yeah, like some colleges are building climbing walls, and they're just including in the cost of tuition. Is that really, like, you know, if you look at college in 1950 compared to college today, like, they didn't have delivery sushi as part of your tuition, which actually exists at some colleges. Right. You know, like, yes, college costs more because it adds these amenities, and colleges are doing it to attract students, and then some of those students can't afford to keep going, or, you know, are distracted by them, quite frankly.
Interesting.
So it's just kind of you just don't see colleges do it the other way anymore so much, which kind of makes our one-to-one comparison hard.
Yeah.
Like, which is what I would actually want to see. If a college didn't offer those things and they still attracted decent students with lower tuition costs, would their students be in the same position as the general population students, or would they be better off?
Right.
And unfortunately, that's just not a study that can happen, but you would see college graduation rates lower back then when there were fewer colleges, who admitted fewer students, who didn't have all of these add-ons.
Yeah.
So it's just kind of a, causation is not correlation and correlation is not causation, but
Yeah, interesting.
Okay, Richard.
Well, for like voters, you can have like a fluid democracy sort of thing where you select to give your vote to the person you deem qualified in that certain topic, like in climate change or whatever. Or you can have a person who you get sort of like a test. Everyone gets one vote, but you can like take a test to verify your knowledge of it, so you can get multiple votes for certain topics or whatever.
Interesting.
Yeah.
And your mom?
So my mom says, I completely support any amount of freedom in regarding education. How, when, and why people learn could be more closely honored with the existence of UBI.
Cool.
So I think she's basically just saying that when we have basic income, people will more learn what they want to learn because they're interested in learning it instead of these other incentives.
And also in their own personalized ways is kind of an interesting thing to chin out there too.
And I think that's right. And I don't know what our education system is going to look like under UBI, but I do imagine that it's going to evolve and transform greatly. And I'm really excited about it because I think we have the resources to provide everyone with a really, really great education.
One added thing, even though I already talked, is like we didn't even talk about very much about more people becoming like educators, which is kind of like a fun thing to do that people might do under UBI.
Definitely.
So you might have more in-person educators.
Yep. All right, thanks guys.
Thanks everyone.